The Gospel writers may have covered up the historical John the Baptist, manipulating the story in order to promote their agenda about Jesus. We may be able to reconstruct the real John the Baptist by examining the ancient propaganda techniques used by the biblical authors. Let's begin by taking a look at the birth narrative of John the Baptist. Ancient propagandists used emphasis when changing a part of the narrative. In this case, emphasis is found in the assertion that Zechariah was the father of John the Baptist. The biblical author tells us repeatedly in Luke chapter 1 that Zechariah was John the Baptist's father, even mentioning it again in chapter 3. We're also told repeatedly that Elizabeth was Zechariah's wife. Taken together, these points of emphasis indicate that, historically, John the Baptist was not the son of Zechariah. But if that's the case, whose son was he? If the father was known, he would typically be mentioned somewhere in the text and explained away. However, in the case of illegitimate children, no candidates for the real father are found in the text. Thus, John the Baptist seems to have been an illegitimate child with no known father. The biblical author appears to be writing to cover up his illegitimate birth. To cover up the culturally shameful situation of John's birth, Luke 1:6 says that both Zechariah and Elizabeth were righteous in the sight of God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and the requirements of the Lord. And in Luke 1:24, it says, "Now after these days his wife Elizabeth became pregnant, and she kept herself in seclusion for 5 months, saying, 'This is the way the Lord has dealt with me in the days when he looked with favor upon me, to take away my disgrace among the people.'" And again in Luke 1:57, it says, "Now the time has come for Elizabeth to give birth, and she gave birth to a son. Her neighbors and her relatives heard that the Lord had displayed his great mercy toward her, and they were rejoicing with her." The author here spends the birth of John the Baptist in a positive light, essentially saying, with such rejoicing, how could John the Baptist be an illegitimate son? The original reader may have objected that there was no tradition of Zechariah fathering John the Baptist. Having Zechariah become mute until after the birth of John the Baptist may have been an attempt by the biblical author to counter that objection. The author also has to explain why Zechariah didn't name his son after someone in his family. Zechariah and Elizabeth were an infertile couple who had a son in their old age. If that sounds familiar, that's because we find a similar story with Abraham and Sarah. Many of the same propaganda techniques are used in that narrative, and as I've discussed in previous videos, Isaac was also an illegitimate son. Even though the father of John the Baptist may have been unknown, John himself made a bold claim as to who his father was, and this claim could have been the very foundation of his rise to prominence. In order to discover who John the Baptist claimed to be his father, we have to take a close look at a parable of Jesus, the parable of the vine growers. In the Gospels, many of the teachings of Jesus have the same structure as propaganda, which we can usually divide into 3 parts. The original teaching of Jesus, a statement asserting no one understood the teaching, and a reinterpretation provided by the biblical author to convey their intended meaning. Sometimes it's just the original teaching and the reinterpretation. This is the structure that the parable of the vine growers has, with Mark 12, verses 1 through 9, being the original teaching, and verses 10 through 12 being the reinterpretation. We need to isolate verses 1 through 9 and ask ourselves what the original meaning may have been. The parable of the vine growers tells the story of a landowner who plants a vineyard and leases it to tenants before traveling to another country. When harvest time comes, he sends servants to collect his share of the fruit, but the tenants beat, kill, or stone them. Finally, the landowner sends his son, thinking they will respect him, but the tenants kill the son, hoping to seize his inheritance. The biblical author wants us to understand the son in the story as referring to Jesus. But if this was not the original meaning of the parable, then who was the son? To find out, we have to take a look at the only other named person who was killed by authorities in the Gospels, John the Baptist. I propose that John the Baptist was primarily a political revolutionary, claiming to be the Son of God and the rightful heir to the throne of Israel. The Gospel accounts of his execution serve as propaganda, reframing what was likely a politically motivated event into a theologically centered narrative. This shift is achieved by portraying John's death as stemming from his moral criticism of Herod's unlawful marriage to Herodias, rather than from his political claims and actions. The Gospel authors explicitly describe John as a holy and righteous man, emphasizing theological reasons and deflecting attention from any political implications. They further depict Herod in a relatively favorable light, telling us that Herod executed John reluctantly and only because of an oath, a technique also used in the biblical portrayal of Jephthah, who is shown as tragically bound by his vow to Yahweh when he sacrifices his daughter. Be sure to check out my video on child sacrifice in the Bible to learn more about Jephthah. Moreover, John's execution by beheading, an act typically reserved for crimes such as political rebellion, required justification for the original reader. The Gospels achieve this by introducing the dramatic and sensational detail of Herodias' daughter requesting John's head on a platter. This not only shifts the blame to Herodias and her daughter, but also provides a more personal and scandalous explanation for John's death, further obscuring its potential political motivations. Through these narrative techniques, the biblical authors reframe John's execution to emphasize its theological significance, aligning it with their broader agenda of presenting John as a forerunner to Jesus rather than a political threat to Herod and Roman authorities. But some might ask, what about Josephus? Doesn't he corroborate the biblical account? Not necessarily. I'll assume for the moment that the account in Josephus is not a later interpolation. Remember, Josephus was also a propagandist for Rome. If he's corroborating anything, he's corroborating the biblical propaganda. But there are noticeable differences that highlight the distinct concerns of Josephus versus the biblical authors. Josephus also does not want John the Baptist to be viewed as a rebel leader, describing him as a good man, just like the Gospels do. But the reason for John's arrest and execution is different here. In this account, it's not Herodias that is the cause, but rather Herod's paranoia. It's not that John the Baptist was raising a rebellion, Josephus tells us. It's that he could have raised a rebellion. So Herod put him to death just in case. This again gave the original reader a plausible misunderstanding. Oh, you thought John the Baptist was executed because he raised a rebellion? No. He was executed because Herod was afraid that he would. Closely associated with the claim of being the Son of God was the claim that John the Baptist was the Messiah, or the Christ. This prompts the biblical authors to explicitly deny that John was the Messiah. John the Baptist was also considered to be the light. The Gospel of John responds by shifting this title to Jesus. If John claimed to be a royal heir, he would have dressed accordingly. Biblical authors attempt to change the narrative on this point by emphasizing John in humble clothing, with Mark 1:6 pointing out that John was clothed with camel hair and wore a leather belt. In the Gospel of Matthew, the biblical author uses a propaganda technique that I refer to as begging the answer. This technique answers a question that the original reader would have answered in the positive, but the biblical author puts it into a context to answer it in the negative. In this case, John did wear fine clothes, since he considered himself to be Israel's future king. But the biblical author denies that this was the case. The Gospel of Mark uses a propaganda technique to give the original reader a plausible misunderstanding regarding John's claim to be the Son of God. Mark 1:9-11 describes the baptism of Jesus by John. In the account, God says, "You are my beloved Son, in you I am well pleased." But who is God talking to here? It never says who God was addressing, John or Jesus. Obviously, the context of the Gospels caused the reader to infer that he was speaking to Jesus. But for the original reader, it provided a plausible misunderstanding, essentially saying, "Oh, you thought God was talking to John the Baptist? No. He was speaking to Jesus." Turning back to the parable of the vine growers, we can now see the original meaning of the parable. The son who was murdered by the vine growers is symbolic of John the Baptist being executed by the political authorities. If Jesus himself believed that John the Baptist was the Son of God, then we must take that into account when trying to understand the original meaning of the teachings of Jesus, and how that event was the catalyst of his ministry, or I should say, political rebellion. In my next video, I'll go through the teachings of Jesus in this light to give us a better understanding of the original meaning of his teachings before the biblical authors changed the narrative.